Michael's asked me, how did I propose to his mother? Um, we were at NAU, and it was in the fall of 1974. I had just gotten off a mission, and some weeks before, we had been out collecting bugs for my entomology class, Ellen and I, and they're in Flagstaff at NAU. And later that day, we went and picked out rings for both her and I. And then when the rings finally got in, I invited, we were in the dorm there at NAU, and I called her dad, Wayne Davis, and asked if I could marry his daughter, and he said fine, that would be acceptable. And then I proposed to her, and on that night we had Ellen's younger brother Gary with us, and we had a bottle of grapefruit juice that looked like champagne, and so we opened that up and drank out of little plastic cups, if I'm not mistaken, and that was the night that I proposed to Michael's mother. What were some of my favorite books? Well, when I was younger, one comes to mind. I was 17 at the time and had just started dating Ellen Ray, and we were there in high school, and she had loaned me a book called 17th Summer. Well, we were 17 at the time when we started dating, and I remember reading that book, and it kind of paralleled our relationship to a degree, and I remember later I needed to write a book report, so I chose to write it on that book. And my English teacher, who I really quite liked, commented on that by saying that I really needed to broaden my horizons and reach a little bit further and not write about something silly, as silly as 17 Summer. But at the time it was kind of like watching Haley Mills in Summer Magic. I always thought Ellen looked a lot like Haley Mills. I fabricated a story for my mother, who I dearly loved. Her nickname was Mooch. I don't know quite where that came from, but that's what I called her, my Mooch. And I always used to say that, Mooch, you're a good woman. That was as close as I could say to I love you. But I did, and do. Kirk and I were out at his ranch with a backhoe, and he had told me that he had found an old Indian burial ground, and would I be interested in seeing it? And so I went out with him, and I think he might have been out there digging post holes at the time, but he had a backhoe. And he took a divining rod or a stabbing rod, a long steel pole, and pushed it into the ground until he found an area that was soft, and that was where he had dug some weeks before. And so he got that backhoe out and dug about 5 or 6 feet, and darned if he didn't find 2 or 3 skeleton heads and some other bones. And I took one of those skeleton heads. I later returned it, but yes, I did take one. And a story started to form in my brain. And so when I got home, I came into the house. I actually prepared myself by kind of running in place for a short while to look short, to sound out of breath and have a flushed face. And I came in through the front door into our home, and I told my mother that a great, wonderful thing had happened. That while Kirk and I were out digging post holes, we had uncovered a tunnel, and that we followed the tunnel back about 15 or 20 feet into the side of a hill. And we had flashlights, fortunately, and we crawled into the side of that hill that was obscured from view, and we discovered a small room. And in that room were conquistador skeletons, helmets and breastplates, with arrows stuck in the breastplates. I said, but that's not all, Mother. And it was about that time that I presented the skeleton head, told her that this was the skull of one of the conquistadors, that the Indians must have set upon them, because everyone knew that the conquistadors had come through the St. John's area. I told her that there was a box full of coins, and I had a silver doubloon that my mother had given me from being a member of National Geographic. It was counterfeit, of course, but she had forgotten that she had given me that. And also a piece of pyrite, fool's gold. And I produced both of those. And I told her that the treasure was unbelievable, that there were 65 bars of silver and 35 bars of gold, and that the silver probably weighed 30, 40 pounds, and the gold maybe 15 to 20 pounds. And then I told her that she needed to brace herself, because it was not found on Patterson property. It was found on Davis property. And she looked rather stricken, and I said, oh, Mother, not to worry. I said, Kirk has promised to give me 50% of everything we find. She teared up and said, I've always loved those Davises. Such fine people, those Davises. I then instructed or asked her where we could put it, and she said that we could move the Baldwin piano, and we could put some sheets down on our floor, and we could bring all the treasure in, but we should go at night so that there were no prying eyes and greedy fingers. And she was going to call my Uncle Rob and get a pickup. I went down to Esther's and Wayne's and laughed for a while, and decided that I'd better go back up there and tell her the truth. And when I did, she was on the phone with my Aunt Colleen. When I walked in, she said, what are you doing here? Why aren't you out guarding the treasure? And that's when I told her that it was all a fabrication. And that's when she called me a son of a bitch. The relationship with my mother was founded on love and friendship. She was my best friend. And we never argued, or very rarely. Never had a cross word. And in fact, my sister Robin said that whenever I would come into the room, my mother's eyes would light up, and her whole disposition would change. Well, I don't know how true that was, but that's what my sister thought. I can remember once I was there at the kitchen table with Ellen, and I'd been in medical school for 3 or 4 months, and we'd come home to St. John's to visit, and we're sitting there, and I happened to say to my mother, rather sarcastically, where, I wonder, honey came from. Mama, where does honey come from? She said, why, it comes from bees, Richie. And I said, you think? That was when she beamed me in the head with a banana. But I loved her. We used to watch Chiller every Friday night. That was a TV special, much like Twilight Zone. And she didn't like them, and she'd cover her eyes sometimes, but we would watch them. She would come in and watch them with me. And that was the relationship I had with my mother.
How did she act when you graduated from medical school?
Oh, she was very proud. At our graduation, my mother, Faye, Sandra came, Charlie, Moore, Colleen, and Robin, and Fred, and Ellen were there. And it was a very proud moment for her. Fred had gone to law school and had graduated, and I had just finished with my medical school and was preparing to go and do a residency in anesthesia at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. This was in 1980. I can remember our home was right across from the pool, and it wasn't but half a block from the courthouse and the jail. And my aunt Josephine would periodically, she being a widow, as was my mother, would periodically call my mother and let her know if there'd been a jailbreak. Well, one night, at about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, my mother got a call from her sister Josephine, and my mother was told that there had been a jailbreak that night. It was rather alarming to my mother, and I remember her, and this was unbeknownst to me, I didn't know it at the time, I was in the back bedroom, and my mother in a loud voice said, "Richie! Richie! Get the gun, Richie! Get the gun and come." Standing up, walking out of the bedroom, I said, "What gun, Mother? We have no gun. We've never had a gun. I've wanted a gun, but you've never bought me one. We have no gun. What are you talking about?" She then swore at me and said that I was really slow with the uptake. When, two stories quickly, when Ellen and I went to San Francisco, I believe that was in part of my residency. I was to work there at San Francisco General Hospital for 2 months. And my mother was very concerned because of the Andrea fault line. And when we told her that we had rented this little apartment, we're living in this boarding house, she was so fearful that we had rented right on top of the Andrea fault line. And I told her that she needn't worry, that it was just a couple of feet to the side, and she was so relieved to know that we were not right on top of the fault line, but a couple of feet to one side. The other experience was when I got a residency in New Orleans, and she had read in Reader's Digest about water moccasins, these venomous snakes, and how they would come up onto the porch and wait until the door would open, and then they would strike and kill the man or woman or child, and that I should always be very careful when I went outside to look both ways and down at my feet to make sure I didn't step on a water moccasin, because they were so plentiful in New Orleans, according to the article. Well, when we moved to New Orleans, I remember pulling in, we had 2 U-Hauls, and I pulled off the road to get some gas or something, and Ellen was right behind me, and there was this little black girl working as the cashier, and she happened to notice that the plates were registered Arizona, and she asked us where we were from, and we said, "Well, we're from Arizona," and she said, "Oh, that where those snakes are." And when she said that, I knew that we were going to be just fine, and consequently there were no water moccasins ever seen. How did I meet my spouse? Well, shoot, how about 5th grade, kindergarten? I was aware of Ellen Ray from the get-go. Blonde and blue-eyed, very vivacious. More importantly, she was always very kind through middle school and high school. I was never aware of any unkind thing that she did. She was very talented, she was very athletic, and way out of my league. And I remember I was a junior in high school and matured some. And my cousin Elise approached me. I was there at the drinking fountain, there in the hallway at the high school, and was taking a sip from the drinking fountain when my cousin Elise said that Ellen Ray wouldn't mind if I took her to the senior hop. Well, I couldn't believe that, and it took quite a while to get up the courage to ask her, but she agreed, and I went and picked her up. And this is a young man that had never had any experience with a girl, had never held a hand, had never kissed a girl. And that night, we held hands. And afterward, I had a Chevy Impala that my mom let me drive. That was a demo from Patterson Motor. I'd vacuumed it and washed it and all. And Shelley Moore and Greg Anderson were in the back seat. We double dated, and Ellen and I were in the front. And for two people that had never said two words to each other, prior to that, we talked for 3 hours nonstop. In fact, she said that I was the only boy she'd ever found that was easy to talk to and that would listen. And we were off and running, and shortly thereafter fell in love, and she waited. We went to NAU for a year, and we were called Salt and Pepper because we were inseparable by people. And she waited 2 years, and I got back, and we were married. Got back in August, and we were married in June. As for missionary experiences, one comes to mind. I was in the language training mission in Provo, Utah. We were there for 8 weeks, and I was to learn Spanish, and was then to go to the Eastern State Spanish Mission, which was located in New York City. And I felt overwhelmed with and inadequate in my studies and in being there, and was quite emotional at times, and lost quite a lot of weight while I was there. And it was an evening, and the study hall was filled with missionaries, and we had little cubicles that we sat at, and I was sitting alone and either studying a lesson or reading from my scriptures, and probably appeared distressed, which I'm sure I was. And a young man, a missionary, approached me from where I don't know, and took my Doctrine and Covenants and opened it up to the 6th section. I think it's verses 35 to 39, I think, and had me read that. And in essence, what it was saying was that my Savior, Jesus Christ, didn't fault me in anything that I had done. That my sins were forgiven, that I needed to serve with a sober mind and to look upon the wounds in his hands and feet, and to go on and be the very best missionary I could be, and that exaltation would be mine if I would do that. Now, some 40 years later, I have a grandson, Caden Bast. That's Michael's oldest boy, and he's preparing to go to Australia to teach Mandarin Chinese. And he's studying his Book of Mormon, and for whatever reasons, he's having difficulty getting through it. And he is prompted to open up the Doctrine and Covenants, and he does. And he turns to section 6 and reads those same verses. He later uses this in his farewell address to the ward. He was not aware that I had had this experience, but when he had shared it with me is when I told him that that was the same scripture that I had been given years and years before. Now that to me is a tender mercy. As for other experiences in the mission field, I was rather reticent to do street meetings. We would have these placards that were out in front, like Christ in America, or Families Are Forever, or Ancient America Speaks, and the Book of Mormon, a Second Testament of Jesus Christ. But we would do these street meetings, and we were in Jersey City, New Jersey, and not far from the subway. And when the train would stop, there would be thousands of people that would spill out. And it was, I think, on a Friday or Saturday afternoon early, and it had started to snow lightly, and we were standing out there on the corner with a billboard, and families went by and would pass them pamphlets. We had pamphlets both in Spanish and English. And a little Puerto Rican family came up, and we didn't think much of that. We thought, they're probably just gonna wad it up and throw it away. And I handed it to the wife, and we quickly wrote down their address. Well, about a week later, we're making follow-up calls, and We go up to the 6th floor of a tenement house there in Jersey City and knock on the door, and this little Puerto Rican woman comes, and of course we're expecting them to say not interested or they've moved or something, and she says that her husband's not there, and of course we think, yeah, sure, he's not. He's probably in the back bedroom. She said, but he read the pamphlet and he has lots of questions and he wants us to return. Well, the very next thing we thought was, well, he's probably a Jehovah's Witness or Seventh-day Adventist and is laying wait for us, but of course we will. So 2 or 3 days later, we come back and he wants to know everything we have to say about the church. He did read the pamphlet, the testimony of Joseph Smith, the first vision, and he believes it. And 3 weeks later, having given up his alcohol, his tobacco, and his women, he joins the church. A month later, his wife joins the church. Since then, he has been totally committed to the church, has served multiple missions, was responsible for the baptizing of over 100 of his relatives back in Puerto Rico when he went back for a short while. And he now lives in Utah. His name is Edgardo Collazo. And he used to call Elder Dally, that was my companion who has since passed on, and me his saviors. Saviors of gold. And I would say, oh, don't say that. We're not saviors. Jesus Christ is our Savior. And he would say, you saved me for a life that would have been filled with sorrow and perhaps great tragedy, because he said he was contemplating suicide that would have involved the murder of his family also. As for my testimony, having grown up in the church, I relied a lot on the testimony of others, and that we were all LDS there in that community. Most of us were. But I had grandparents that taught me at a very early age about the importance of being a good boy and believing in Jesus Christ and the prophet Joseph Smith, and my mother also. And taught me to be faithful. And my testimony was gradual. When I was in the mission field, when I was in the LTM, and this may sound silly, but I was quite immature. When I was in the LTM, I started to experience heartburn. At least I thought it was heartburn. And I thought it was indigestion, but I now know it was the Holy Ghost, and it was constant. But I was so immature that I didn't recognize it at the time. I later grew to know what it was. When I served as a bishop, I can say that I felt the presence of the Holy Ghost every day that I served. And every day was joyful. There were difficult things, but every day I felt empowered and joyful in serving. As for hobbies and activities that I engaged in as a youth, I loved football. Football to me was everything. My mother bought me a uniform. Well, she bought a used uniform. I think Jim Thorpe might have played in it. Big old baggy gold pants and high top cleats that she had gotten from Colleen. Lived in the valley and lived next to a neighbor, and the neighbor gave her son's old high school uniform. And so I had big old baggy pants and high top cleats that didn't fit, but I had the pants dyed gold, and my mother bought me a red jersey and got me a blue helmet in Holbrook, and I had shoulder pads. And football for me was everything, and I really had pretty good hands. My Uncle Rob seemed to think that I had pretty good hands, and I loved to be an offensive end. I wasn't very fast, but I more times than not came up with the football. If it was thrown to me, I could connect with the football and hold on to it. I took an interest in coaching at a very early age, and though it wasn't official Pop Warner, I had a little league football team, had 15 to 20 guys that at one time or another played for me. They're all grown now, and our colors were green and gold, much like the Green Bay Packers, because that's kind of who I liked at the time with Bart Starr. And we played Kenny Pulsifer, and I have pictures of that and film. My son Michael actually took my 8mm film and put it all on one reel, and I have moving pictures of these little boys playing on the fairgrounds where there was no grass at the time. And we had 2 or 3 official games, and I think they won at least 1 or 2 of them. I know they won at least 1. They might have won 2 out of 3. I don't remember. Those boys later on in high school took state in football. And I remember having someone saying that I was partly responsible for that. Well, I don't know about that. Johnny Negley was coaching, and he had played for the University of Arizona. But people thought that was my little team. And maybe in some minor way, them having been exposed to football at such an early age, maybe it helped in some way. I also loved filming. I've always wondered if perhaps I hadn't gone into medicine, if I might have gone into archaeology, or as a director. I loved to film, and my mother had an 8mm Bell and Howell camera that she had had for years, and I got that. The problem with the 8mm was that the film, you could only film 2.5 minutes on one side, and then you'd have to open up the case and flip the film on the other side to expose the other end. And I was outside filming these little boys, and so would try to cover up with a coat or something, and I lost lots of film, but some came through. And I filmed Zulu Wars with my cousin Dana and Craig. They were white natives, you know, we were on a limited budget. And I filmed Gettysburg, parts of Gettysburg. And I filmed, my first film was covering the Revolutionary War. I had little British uniforms. Dana was in it. He was a colonial, had a colonial uniform on. We had a little fire going on. I loved making films. And the last film I did, I think it was right before I went off to college. No, it might have been, no, it was right before I left on a mission. And that was it. It was over. When I got back, it was college and medical school. But for that time, I loved all of it. And I have my sons provided for me about 45 minutes worth of film. I've been asked what things can I remember that I had done as a youth that I might be embarrassed of. Well, one was living next to the pool. Kenny Pulsifer, David Wolford came by, and maybe Kirk Davis, I don't remember, and we climbed over the pool. It was like at midnight, and went swimming in the pool, jumping off the high dive, and the police came. Edgar Merrill, that was Freddie Merrill's father. He was the sheriff of Apache County at the time, and I think one of his deputies came by. And so we climbed over the fence and had to do a circuitous route to get back home. And I can remember hiding in a cornfield and having the policeman stop with a spotlight and shining across the field. I felt like I was with Steve McQueen in The Great Escape. It was exhilarating. Edgar Merrill, Sheriff Merrill, later asked if my mother knew of any young men that might have been swimming in the pool at that time. Another thing was I'm a freshman in high school, and I don't have a date for the junior prom, and we're in seminary at the time, and Johnny Lee tells me that if I don't ask Valerie Platt by the end of the hour, he will. Well, I quite liked her at the time, and I stewed and fretted the whole time, and as it got nearer and nearer, I became more and more panicked and didn't know quite what I was going to do. And so after the final song was sung, hymn, and the final prayer, I stood up in class in seminary and shouted out in the loudest voice I possibly could, "Valerie, will you go to the junior prom with me?" And she said she would, and we still laugh about that, she and I, whenever I see her. When I think about things that I'm proud of, there are quite a few. One was that my sophomore year, I had got bumped up to second string varsity, which really wasn't anything. Earl Patterson was the coach of the JV team, and they were in need of a tight end, and they were playing Round Valley there in St. John's. And so I was sent back down to play, and that's Round Valley and St. John's has over a 100-year period of rivalry, and the win-loss has been about the same for both teams. And so this is my second year in high school, sophomore, and I'm playing JV football. And I'm sent in to play one of the tight ends, and I knew all the plays. They were the same as the varsity. And Garth Drain was quarterbacking. And I remember him telling me that he was going to have me run and cross the center, and that he was going to attempt to throw me a pass. And he did, and I scored a touchdown. And then I scored a second touchdown. And for whatever reasons, on defense, their men weren't picking me up, and I must have tackled or at least wrapped my arms around the quarterback 10 to 15 times. I'm surprised that they never picked up on stopping me, but their coach never did. And at the end of the game, 4 or 5 boys, Murray Patterson was one of them, rushed out there, lifted me up, and carried me off the field. And I was conscious. As for bullies in my life, there was one. He was Native American. My 7th grade year, his name was Jimmy Johnson. He started to torment me. He would put his fists up and then kind of slap punch, where he'd slap my face. Not hard, but just poke at it. And I was intimidated, and I had not had that happen before. And I let that go on for probably half a year. That summer, I was working for Jim Hauser and was cultivating fields, and could think of nothing other than that and the humiliation that I suffered, and I got angrier and angrier and angrier. So, the beginning of my 8th grade year, we're in Mr. Madrid's class. I don't know where the teacher was, but there were boxing gloves, and Jimmy Johnson and I put on the gloves. And the boxing match lasted probably for 2.5 minutes. I pummeled him. I couldn't believe at what poor boxing skills he had. He was flaying at me, and I knocked him away and punched him enough to where he dropped his head, and then I punched his head. Now that may not sound like the right thing to do, but I punched his head enough to where when he called quit, we took the gloves off and sat down, and he went and rested his head on the table, never to bother me again. As for talents, I sometimes kind of wonder about those. I know that I had a decent singing voice. I actually took music instruction at NAU and was asked why I wasn't in the honors choir there. I remember that. And I loved singing in the church choir, and I would get a lot of compliments from people that sat near me about my voice. That was nice. I come from a family, 2 sides of the family, that are very talented. My grandmother, Mama Josie, had a beautiful singing voice. Actually studied at the Conservatory of Music in Chicago, and was told that she had the voice quality to travel Europe, but she chose to return and marry her sweetheart, my grandfather, Dad Patterson. On my paternal side, they were vaudevillian actors. And my grandmother, Louise Metcalf, I was told by my mother, was once hailed as a songbird of some part of the South. And so I had that on both sides of my family. I enjoy writing, I enjoy telling stories, and I've been told that I can sometimes spin a pretty good story. I've actually written 3 books. They haven't been terribly successful. Bubble Up, Guardians of the Veil, and The Day I Gave a Birthday Away, but I did self-publish them, and they're on Amazon. Played the trombone in high school, was never very good, but also played the piano. I think my mother had me take 6 to 8 years of piano. Never was very good at that either, and finally I got her to let me quit. I truly care for people. I do. My whole motto is, I'm going to like you unless you give me a real good reason not to like you. And I've found very, very few people that I haven't liked. As a bishop, there wasn't a sacrament meeting that went by that I didn't have a child come up and sit on my lap. They usually came from dysfunctional families. Usually the father wasn't around, and I would have a different child on my lap every sacrament meeting. I'm sure people that didn't know me well probably wondered how many wives I might have had, because I had Hispanic and black and white children that would come up and sit on my lap. So those are, I also have always felt quite kind towards animals. I never took any joy in branding calves. I always felt sorry for them. And I always felt sorry for the Holocaust victims. I remember in medical school, I would send small amounts of money to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which was used to help pay for the Holocaust Memorial there in Los Angeles, or wherever they had one. And so I guess in a way, empathy or feelings for others, compassion might have been a talent of mine. That and talking, as you can see. I sure love to talk. I don't say much, but I sure love to talk. When I was an anesthesiologist, I used to tell this joke, which I think angered some of my male physicians. It was about 3 men that get marooned on an island. They're out in the South Pacific, and there's no way that they're going to escape. And a bottle washes up, and they uncork it, and out pops a genie. And the first man stands up and he says, "I want my wish, genie." And the genie said, "Yes, your wish is my command." And the man said, I want to be 50% smarter. 50% smarter. Give it to me, genie. Poof! 50% smarter. Well, the second man, not to be outdone, stepped up and said, "Genie, I want to be 75% smarter. 75%. Poof! You're 75% smarter." Well, the third man stood up and said, "Genie, I want to be 100% smarter." The genie shook his head and he said, "I don't think you know what. I want to be 100% smarter. Genie, give it to me now. That's what I want." "As you wish." Poof! You're a woman.